I'm going to end up this part right now. We see we put in the work point up there, and we're going to kind of look over here. Remember, we can right click and look at what's there. We can show it, you know, ground. We can do all kinds of different stuff with this. But we have set up in this piece here, right? We have actually have one hole which we've placed there, and we put a work axis in the hole. So if we go here, we can do work axis of the hole. We hit that double click here, and we've got a hole which we're going to be able to match, and we have a UCS set up in the top left corner. We've learned a little bit how to use precision input, and we can do right again, file, save. I'm going to go one more time into now one other one and just show you that that can be set up very similarly. We hit file, close. And you can have more than one thing open. We're not going to go ahead and do a new one as much as we're going to open. Then we're going to go ahead and go with this horizontal. Again, we would have made this pretty basic part. Here's your front. We've got, again, within here we have showing this time, you can see I've done some moving of the body. I've got some history. You got a lot of history on here. And in this case, I've got the x-axis where I can right-click, turn on the x-axis off, and right-click the y-axis off. And so we have something there in case we want to move or do something like that with the precision input. So remember, again, of course, this we started by bringing in a sketch block, but we can go into here, right, and we have this piece, and we can actually go ahead and within here we can click within there, and now we can do, if we need to, we could move. I'm sorry, you got to double click within the sketch block. Once you get to the sketch, now you have some ability. You can see the context driven. You can do a couple of things. You could rotate, you know, and we can rotate, right? Once again, we can select our objects, grab them all, and maybe we can grab the center point. Maybe we rotate about that end, and we can then give it a very precise rotation depending what we needed. So we can go ahead and set this show dimensions. We could change the dimensions. We might be able to make it just 30 degrees. Apply, and done. So we've done this kind of movement. I'm going to go ahead and just set that back again, because really when you see these parts, they're, you know, what this you've seen is it's retained that kind of 0, 0 point. There is something we might or might not want to do. So once again, if you're in the sketch mode, you can go ahead and grab everything. You can then get a rotation point. You can use, you know, any number of tools, but once you're in this sketch mode, you have one set of tools and you have a different set of tools in something else. So we're at the rotate here. We're going to select our center point. Perhaps that would be there, and we can then rotate it to perhaps 0 degrees. Don't know. We're rotating it and we're kind of moving things around here. So we're going to just leave that as it is. You get a couple different ideas and the kind of tools and how you got to learn to play around. But I want to point out here, right click, you finish your sketch, and you have that hole there. And a hole has, if you would, you know, a couple of things that are kind of important, but for sure, implied or not, is the fact that you can usually put in a work axis on the hole. So that hole there, right, you can add a work axis to it, and it actually has one already applied to it. So that work axis is there. So we can kind of right click, show that one, visibility, turn it off, work axis, right click, visibility, turn it on. So we've got some sort of process there. All right, so we've got a couple of pieces here. And what we're going to do now is go in to show you how the assembly starts to work. One final thing we can do is we can show you again how important this UCS is, and the fact that in this piece, you know, even though we've got it turned a couple of different ways, we can just kind of go and declare a UCS, take it to that corner, and then it seems to be very specific to want corners of pieces. So if you notice there, it's got an X and a Y. I can now say File, Save, close that out. and we put things together in an assembly. So we're going to go with a new assembly here, pointing out finally and kind of emphatically really the way to go about doing this once you get done with the simple work of a couple piece is to use sketch blocks. Draft things in Autocad in 2D, make sketch blocks of them, and make parts of the sketch blocks. And we'll do a series of videos on that. We do want to get to a point where we've added a couple of bolts and some points of rotation, and then get into looking at both the finite analysis stuff and the kind of studio. So I'm just going to place to start. Remember that gusset plate. Open here, and that brings that gusset plate, and it should bring it into generally 0, 0. And now I'm going to go ahead and place what I think it was going to be, let's see, slanted and horizontal. That horizontal part here, going to go ahead and bring it in. It's kind of odd to think you just kind of bring it in willy-nilly, if you would. Done. Now you've got a couple of things, different ways you can constrain these, and let's first start with constraining them by having the user coordinate systems line up. And you'll also find out then there's the ability to kind of move in and out of the z-plane as you would. But if you look here, if we have these things line up so their x, y's, and z's are the same, this is going to turn this piece down. Even though it's not centered in the it's not centered in the gusset plate, it will show you how these kind of linkages work. So you can look at the constraint here, look at the constraint set, and basically they're showing you UCS to UCS. You can select then this one there, and the second one jumps to there, and then it just pops right there. So if you can set those UCSs in, you're actually doing an awfully good job. And you can then see over here on the left, right, this fact of having the gusset plate is actually right-click, is tied, it's grounded. So later on you're going to want to necessarily perhaps get rid of that. So that's tied to the earth, if you would. The other way to go about then doing this, you see it grabbed all of those, all that's very simple UCS kind of constraint, right? Added a whole lot of different constraints. So if we go to here, we can go right-click and delete that one. And we can go right here and we can delete this next one. And we can go right-click and delete the third one. I don't know that you can necessarily delete, but one thing that you might do instead of doing things by matching UCSs is learn one of the more important ones, I believe, when you do a lot of stuff, is this kind of insert. And that insert, generally, if you kind of grab two holes, very typically things are going to line up pretty nicely. And you notice right here this offset. I'm going to go ahead and just leave that offset at 0. And I'll show you kind of how this now works because it's constrained. Now if I grab this thing, you see that it's constrained right at that spot. And that's because I've got one hole. If in fact you had two holes, you could constrain the two holes and they'd have everything kind of hunky-dory. And so that starts to be how you look at kind of constraints. I'm going to go ahead and kind of move this thing around again so you can see how tight that is there. And I'll just bring in one last one just to see how one more set of constraints. And you're really going to want to make good use of kind of doing these based on center lines of holes and then also on user coordinate system stuff. And so I'll go ahead and place a new part. The new part I think was the slanted. Okay, call it slanted, and we hit open here. Yes, bring it in. You can kind of, it's really tough to realize you just bring this stuff in kind of willy-nilly, right? Kind of place it, say right-click done, and then you can go about and use all kinds of different constraints. You can do, I'm kind of wheeling in and out here. It's really tough to learn to kind of how the different mice work. It's kind of opposite, if you would, of AutoCAD in terms of the mouse, but I'm kind of going to zoom in here, and I'm going to go ahead and say a constraint, a flush constraint, a opposition as opposed to flush. I'm going to go with a mate constraint. With that, grabs the back side of that, and now I'm going to go ahead and zoom around behind here and grab the front side of that, and realize it sets this offset here. It's pretty interesting that it sets that offset. It more or less makes them parallel, but you can then hit that to 0, and you realize that that go ahead and constrains it to probably the way you want. And now as you move it around, kind of pulling it and maybe make it down towards a hole or something, it stays constrained along there. This is moving in that flat plane. So that's the last of the 20 minutes, so last of the 60 minutes. Thanks for listening, and we'll move on to the next holes and the others in the next series.